My fiancé looked me dead in the eye and said, "My ex is coming to Christmas. I can't bring you. It'll be awkward." That was the moment everything I had meticulously built with him fractured. After I had just finished hunting down thoughtful gifts for his entire family and was planning to ask him to marry me. I didn't scream or break down. I just walked out, leaving the life we had planned scattered on the floor. Months later, he came back, but not for the reason he thought, and certainly not to win me back. My name is Juniper, and at 29, I had constructed a life that rewarded structure. My days were ruled by construction schedules, site inspections, and spreadsheets. I was a structural engineer, comfortable in a world where forces were quantifiable and foundations were solid. Even my nights were methodical. I spent hours in my uptown apartment, tools spread neatly on the floor, restoring the old Camaro I had bought with my first major promotion. My apartment wasn't huge, but the sunlight that spilled across the hardwood every morning always warmed the space, illuminating the many houseplants I kept. It felt like the one corner of the world I truly controlled. All of that started to tilt the day I met Dorian Hale. It happened in the noise and color of a gallery opening in the Rhino Art District, one of those converted warehouses that always smelled faintly of old wood and fresh paint. I was standing perfectly still in front of a massive canvas, splashed with violent shades of orange, absorbing the chaos of the art. When I turned, his eyes, gray and startlingly honest, were already on me. The conversation around us seemed to pull back, and the humming energy of the room quieted until only that moment remained. He told me later he was fascinated by how still I was, how I looked at art the same way some people looked at blueprints, with deep, calculating attention, and I was immediately drawn to how he spoke, his hands constantly moving as if they were trying to shape the air around him into something larger than life. He was messy where I was precise, impulsive where I was calculated, and, for a long time, that imbalance felt like the most perfect, exciting kind of equilibrium. The weeks that followed were a blur of small, deeply intimate moments. Saturday mornings we shared at a cafe in Five Points, the scent of espresso threading through our conversations about his abstract sketches and my concrete job sites. Our evenings were spent side by side, him painting on an easel, me reviewing project plans, the comfortable silence filling the gap between us. We cooked dinners that always ended with music playing too loud, and him twirling me across the kitchen floor, paint still smudged on his forearms. I didn't fall in love all at once. It was quiet, like water slowly rising around my ankles, until one day I looked down and realized I was completely, happily submerged. The first time he took me to Boulder to meet his family, I braced myself for the polite formality I was used to. Instead, his father, Elias, greeted me with a bear hug that actually knocked the air out of me. His mother, Elias's wife, immediately handed me a mug of steaming hot cider, as if she had been saving it just for me. Her name was also Juniper, which Dorian always found funny. That night, as the mountain cold rolled in, Elias draped his own heavy coat over my shoulders and said almost offendedly, "You're the kind of woman this family needs." Something in me softened under that warmth. It felt like belonging. Real, steady, and unforced. A few months later, while we were clearing dishes in his apartment, Dorian looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't often seen and suggested, "Maybe we should move in together." My hands froze on the dish towel, and I felt my heart leap and settle at the very same time. I said yes before any fear of the future had the chance to talk me out of it. From that moment forward, marriage wasn't a distant concept. It became something I quietly planned for, tucked between construction milestones and calendar reminders. If there was a time in my life when I believed I had found a true home, not a physical place, but a person, it was during those months. What I couldn't have imagined then was that the first cracks had already begun forming beneath the solid surface. Even as I was busy convincing myself the foundation was perfect, the first sign was so small I nearly missed it. One morning, as I was brewing coffee, I noticed Dorian lingering over his phone longer than usual. He smiled at something on the screen, a soft, private expression, and when I asked what it was, he quickly locked the phone. "Just a message," he said, before kissing my forehead and slipping into the shower. It shouldn't have meant anything, but something subtle shifted in the air between us, a tiny imbalance I couldn't name. The feeling of unease lingered, but I drowned it out with planning. My strategy for coping with any potential threat to stability had always been to focus on the things I could control. And at that time, I could control the future I was building. I needed that foundation to be absolutely perfect. I had already chosen the ring, a quiet, classic design that felt as steady as I hoped our life would be. I kept it hidden under a stack of old project binders in my closet, the velvet box a heavy little secret. I had also tentatively reserved a table at Ridge View for Christmas Eve, and I started a detailed list taped to my fridge of every item I needed to secure for the proposal and the holidays. It wasn't nerves I felt each morning, but a warm, consuming anticipation that made even the coldest Denver winter feel a little brighter. My focus turned entirely to Christmas. Cherry Creek was already glowing when I walked through it one afternoon. Strings of white lights wrapped every tree, reflecting off the few flakes of snow that had fallen the night before. I moved through the crowds with purpose, checking my list again and again. I chose gifts with the same intense care I used on job sites. Dorian's mother loved antique china. Elias, his father, treasured first edition books about firefighting history. I wanted each present to feel like undeniable proof that I paid attention, that I loved them quietly, deliberately, hoping they could feel the intention behind every choice I made. When I finally brought home the fragile set of antique china for Dorian's mother, I unwrapped it carefully on the counter, a flush of pride blooming in me. Dorian walked through the door just then, and I turned to show him, expecting that familiar spark of appreciation he used to have for anything thoughtful. He glanced at the delicate plates, nodded without lifting his eyes from the message he was typing, and simply said, "That's nice." For a second, I stood frozen, the air thinning around me. The tiny flicker of warning that had surfaced weeks ago now flared slightly hotter. Then his screen lit up again, and before he locked it, I saw the name Meera. I recognized the first four letters. The subtle fracture I had tried to ignore widened just enough to be noticeable. A few days later, he canceled our dinner plans. He said Meera needed help editing photos for her upcoming exhibit and that she was on a tight deadline. He spoke about film grain and lighting setups and creative synergy with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in his work in months. He apologized, but the apology felt rehearsed and distant, the kind delivered by someone whose mind was already elsewhere, whose focus was already fully dedicated to the thing that canceled the plans. I told him it was fine, forcing the words out and trying desperately to mean them, but the truth was, The excuse curled uncomfortably in my stomach. I told myself it was good, he was inspired, that artists were often impulsive, and that I should be happy he was out of his slump. But the excuses wore thin as his time with her expanded. Soon, he began spending almost every evening at an art studio in Low-High, claiming he and Meera were collaborating on a complex concept project. He would come home late, tired, smelling faintly of turpentine and cold air, but also carrying an energy that didn't feel like mine. One night, while I was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by wrapping paper and color-coded schedules, he walked by and let out a sigh. It was the kind of sigh that wasn't meant to be heard but was loud enough to bruise. "You make everything so planned," he said quietly, his voice carrying a strange mix of resignation and resentment. "It feels like nothing ever just happens." The words stung more than they should have. Planning was my mechanism for survival, the way I held my life together, the method I used to stay steady when everything else threatened to spin out of control. Hearing him resent it felt like he was quietly closing a door somewhere inside our relationship. Yet, even as he began drifting into a world that no longer had obvious space for me, I found myself drifting deeper into the idea of proposing. I had already mapped out the entire moment. In my mind, our lives were still moving in tandem toward the future tense. I didn't know then that the ring I hid so carefully would soon become the unexpected weapon he used to break me. I simply held tighter to the conviction that my effort, my intention, and my meticulous planning would ultimately anchor him. I was focused on the solid structure of the future, failing to recognize that the present foundation was rapidly eroding beneath us. I still believed the thoughtful gifts and the hidden ring were enough to anchor the future. I was operating under the engineer's assumption. If the inputs were correct, the output had to be successful. If I loved with meticulous intention, the relationship would hold. The pressure mounted as Christmas approached. I was simultaneously managing the final phase of a large commercial development, a task requiring every ounce of my precision, while internally rehearsing the proposal I had planned for Christmas Eve. One Friday afternoon, wanting to bridge the widening gap between us, I decided to surprise Dorian at the Low-High studio he shared with Meera and take him to dinner. The drive across town felt longer than usual, the traffic heavy with holiday shoppers. When I arrived, the studio door was slightly ajar, a soft, tungsten glow leaking out onto the pavement. I pushed the door open quietly, hoping to catch him off guard. Inside, the warehouse space was vast and mostly empty, save for a small, intensely lit area where Meera stood behind a large, format camera. Dorian was positioned in front of the lens, draped in shadow and light. He wasn't posing dramatically, he was simply being. But the expression on his face, soft, open, completely unguarded, was one I realized I hadn't seen directed at me in months. It was an intimacy reserved not just for the camera, but for the person holding it. When Meera lowered her camera and their eyes met, there was a shared, silent acknowledgement, a kind of creative kinship that felt foreign and isolating to me. Dorian noticed me then. He stepped back suddenly, almost tripping over a sandbag, his demeanor shifting instantly from soft focus to sharp, slightly awkward self-consciousness. He introduced us. "Meera, this is Juniper." "Juniper, Meera." He said my name too casually, too quickly, as if hoping the moment would dissolve before I could truly name the distance I felt. Meera offered a polite, professional smile, and though she was perfectly friendly, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was an unwelcome intruder in their very private space. I declined dinner, claiming a sudden project emergency, and left shortly after. The truth was, the knot in my stomach was too tight to allow food. On the silent drive home, I tried to analyze the scene like a structural failure report. I told myself it was professional artistry. I told myself I was tired, stressed by deadlines, and paranoid. Meera was simply talented and exciting in the way creative people often are. But beneath all my logical excuses, the truth whispered something was shifting, and I didn't know how to stop it because it was something I couldn't even name without sounding hysterical. The final descent began a week later. Dorian canceled our long-standing weekly date night, the time we had explicitly carved out for just the two of us. He said Meera's exhibit was in 72 hours, and they needed an all-nighter for final edits. He sent a text, "So sorry, crunch time. We'll make it up to you." The absence of his presence was becoming louder than the sound of his voice. I spent that evening alone, cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by rolls of shimmering wrapping paper. I had color-coded my cards, labeling them with number 1 for Elias, number 2 for Dorian's mother, and so on. As I worked, trying to regain my sense of control, Dorian came in late and found me there. He sighed, louder this time. "You make everything so planned," he repeated, the words striking harder, now that they were aimed at my vulnerability. "It feels like nothing ever just happens with you." The criticism felt like a door quietly closing, the soft click of a lock turning on my heart. Planning wasn't my flaw, it was my commitment. It was how I expressed my love and kept the world from dissolving into chaos. Hearing him resent it felt like he was rejecting the core of who I was. A few days later, we drove to Boulder for the Hale family's annual pre-holiday dinner. The drive was tense, filled with only the sound of the radio, but the moment we stepped into the house, the warmth hit me. The living room smelled of juniper wood and roasted chicken. Elias pulled me into a hug that instantly thawed my tension. Over dessert, Elias asked, with a knowing look and a raised eyebrow, whether I had any big plans for the holidays. I smiled and dodged the question, but the weight of the secret ring in my pocket felt heavy, warm, and true. The genuine affection and expectation in the Hale's eyes confirmed everything I already believed. I belonged here. And the small cracks I'd noticed were nothing more than stress, my imagination playing tricks on me. Everything was on the right path. But that illusion fractured on the drive home. Snow had begun to drift across the highway, and the road stretched ahead in a soft, white haze. My phone chimed relentlessly in the cup holder. I didn't need to look at it to know who it was. Dorian's screen lit the car every few minutes with a message from Meera, each one slicing through the darkness with a glowing, unwelcome intrusion. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, trying to enforce my usual logical boundaries. Do not overthink, do not panic, do not assume the worst. Yet, as the lights of Denver finally appeared in the distance, a quiet, sickening fear settled in my chest. It was a fear I couldn't explain and didn't yet understand, but one I could no longer ignore. By the time I pulled into our parking garage, the unease had grown into a dense, heavy presence. It told me that trouble had already begun, even if I wasn't ready to face the full scale of it. I knew the moment I stepped inside, the house of cards would come down. 3 days before Christmas, the foundation finally cracked. I was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by ribbons, gift bags, and the neat stack of handwritten cards I'd finished the night before. The apartment was soft and warm under the yellow lights strung along the window. Outside, snow drifted sideways in thick, silent sheets, tapping lightly against the glass. It was peaceful in a way that made me believe, for one fragile moment, that everything was still on track. Then, the front door opened. Dorian stepped inside, shaking snow from his hair. But there was something in the way he stood, hesitant and strangely careful, that made the back of my neck tighten. I watched him, waiting, a sense of quiet dread rising unmistakably. When he finally walked over, his hands were shoved deep into his coat pockets, his shoulders tense. I knew that posture. I had seen it on job sites when the structural report came back with bad news. "Juniper," he said softly. "We need to talk." The words hung in the air like a cold draft. He sat across from me, but left a physical distance that felt symbolic. Like he was already halfway out the door. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, a fast, frantic rhythm, even before he continued. "I can't bring you to Christmas," he said. "Meera's going. It would just be awkward." For a few seconds, the room stopped moving. My breath stilled. Even the snow outside seemed to pause its relentless fall. He watched me with a face that was too calm for the kind of devastating blow he had just delivered. I couldn't speak. My mind was trying to rearrange his words into something that made sense, something that didn't mean what it so clearly meant. He kept talking, filling the awful silence as if the sound of his voice made the decision less cruel. He said Meera made him feel alive again. That being with me felt heavy, predictable, and too structured. He said, I planned everything so tightly that he felt like he was suffocating. His tone was maddeningly neutral, as if he were critiquing a piece of abstract art rather than systematically dismantling the life we had painstakingly built together. Then came the second blow, the realization of the invasion of my only safe space. He confessed that he had seen the ring. He'd gone into my drawer, found the velvet box hidden beneath my binders, and somehow made my intention to commit my life to him feel like manipulation. "You're rushing things," he said. "I'm not ready for that. I don't want to hurt you in front of my family. I'm trying to spare us both. Spare us both." As if humiliation delivered privately, in the cold light of our living room, was some kind of gift. I felt something inside me collapse. Not loudly, but with a quiet, complete, and devastating finality. I looked down at the pile of gifts I had so carefully chosen, the fragile antique china for his mother, the rare history book for his father. The meticulous effort of my love now felt utterly meaningless. I stood, moving with a sudden, rigid focus. I gathered the gifts, stacking them neatly on the coffee table. My voice was steady when I finally spoke, the sound unnaturally calm in the shattered silence. They still deserve to be opened by the people they were meant for. He reached out then, almost instinctively, and said we could still be friends. Friends. The word felt like coarse salt in an open wound. I didn't answer. I simply picked up my coat, wrapped my scarf tightly around my neck, and walked toward the front door. He didn't try to physically stop me. He just watched. As I walked out into the storm, the snow instantly clinging to my hair and melting against my skin, I hurried to my car. I didn't know where I was going, only that staying was impossible. The cold bit into my cheeks, sharp and numbing, but it was still easier to bear than the deep, crushing ache that had begun spreading through my chest. As I drove through the darkened streets, my headlights carving narrow, temporary tunnels through the heavy snowfall, I realized I wasn't just leaving Dorian behind. I was leaving behind the version of myself who believed he would never hurt me, the one who believed effort was always rewarded, and the one who believed love was a powerful enough anchor for someone who was determined to drift away. I didn't know what waited for me on the other side of that night. I only knew that whatever it was, it had to be better than the man who chose someone else 3 days before Christmas and had the audacity to call his betrayal kindness. My silence wasn't fear. It was the final, absolute rejection of his right to my energy, my tears, or my devotion. The life I had planned was gone, replaced by a sudden, terrifying expanse of open road. I found refuge on Rowan's couch, where tears felt too small for the damage. I spent Christmas morning wrapped in one of Rowan's oversized, threadbare fleece blankets. The smell of his slightly burnt toast drifted in from the kitchen. Rowan, my oldest and most pragmatic friend, sat across from me in his recliner. His legs crossed, elbows resting on his knees. He studied my face like I was a complicated blueprint he needed to understand. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "Do you want to cry, kid?" I surprised both of us by shaking my head. "No," I said. "Crying feels too small. I just want to know why. Why did I miss it?" That was the only thing I couldn't shake, the question echoing in every quiet corner of my mind. How could I, the expert in structural integrity, have missed the warning signs that the entire foundation was compromised? Rowan just nodded, offering no easy answers, just quiet presence. He knew that for an engineer, logic and reason are the primary defense against chaos, and when they fail, the shock is total. Throughout the afternoon, my phone, which I had silenced and left on the coffee table, buzzed over and over. I ignored it, expecting Dorian's desperate backtracking. But it wasn't him. It was Juniper, his mother. It was Dorian's mother. She had sent a photo of the delicate, antique china I had picked out, arranged neatly on her dining table, glistening in the light. Under the photo, she wrote, "You will always be family to us." The message hit me in two places, at once a sharp sting where I was hurt by Dorian, and a soft, unexpected warmth where I still cared about them. It was a lifeline of genuine affection, tossed into the turbulent waters of betrayal. A second later, another message appeared. This one was from Elias, Dorian's father. His blunt honesty felt like glass shifting under my feet. "Dorian brought Meera. She doesn't understand anything about our traditions. You should have been here." I set the phone down, unsure whether to smile or break. Their messages offered a recognition of my effort, a validation that Dorian's choice had been noticed, and that I was not alone in my assessment of the situation. Later that evening, Dorian's mother sent a voice memo. In the background, I could hear the clatter of dishes, the low rumble of family conversation, and Meera's voice rising just enough to be clearly heard. She was talking about freedom, about life being too short for commitments and long-term plans. Then, Elias interrupted her, asking plainly what she wanted for her future. Meera didn't hesitate. She said she didn't believe in long-term relationships. She didn't believe love should be tied down. Hearing her say those words made my stomach twist, but not with jealousy. The realization settled heavily. I had been replaced by someone who didn't even want what Dorian claimed I was forcing on him. He hadn't traded my structure for a deeper, truer love. He had traded stability for the temporary illusion of possibility and freedom. He had chosen someone who was structurally incapable of giving him commitment, thereby absolving him of the need to ever commit. Just before midnight, my phone lit up again. This time it was him. I think I made a mistake. Can we talk? 14 words. 14 tiny, desperate words. I stared at the screen until it dimmed, then lit up again with the exact same message, repeated as if sending it twice made it truer. I didn't open either one. I felt something unfamiliar wash over me. Calm. Silence had never felt like power before, but in that moment, it did. I realized that my refusal to engage, my deliberate lack of response, was the first solid structure I had built since walking out the door. The next morning, I woke to a string of messages from people I barely knew, friends of his, acquaintances, even a guy from his studio. They scolded me for walking away too easily, for not being patient, as if they had been in the room when he told me I wasn't welcome at Christmas. Rowan read every message with a disgusted snort, muttering that Dorian had been coddled his whole life, too sheltered to face any consequences. Then came the message that shifted everything again. A mutual friend reached out quietly, not wanting to gossip, but wanting me to know the truth. Meera had left Dorian once before, 3 years ago, because he was too stable, too predictable. The exact same words Dorian had used against me. She hadn't changed. She had simply resurfaced, and he had folded exactly the same way he did the first time. The knowledge didn't hurt, it clarified. He hadn't chosen her over me. He had simply chosen a pattern he didn't know how to break. He was a man running in circles, not forward. By the time the day ended, something inside me had settled. The hurt was still there, raw in places, but beneath it was a steadier resolve. I realized I didn't want answers from him anymore. I wanted my life back. I wanted myself back. I had regained control of the blueprint. The immediate future was now a blank blueprint, and I finally had the space to fill it with my own specifications. The pain was still a constant thrum beneath the surface, but it was no longer a frantic panic. It was an instruction. I tried to return to myself slowly, piece by piece. I signed up for the photography class I had been postponing for months, finding a strange comfort in learning to look at the world through a fixed lens. A different kind of focus than my engineering work, but just as satisfying. I started running again in the cold Denver mornings, steam rising from my breath like proof that I was still alive and moving forward. I focused on the physical discipline, needing the exhaustion to quiet the relentless churn of my mind. I also spent long evenings in Rowan's garage, which he had graciously turned over to me. I had recently bought an Indian Scout motorcycle, and working on it became a form of intense meditation. I tightened bolts and checked clearances with more focus than I had brought to anything in weeks. Each click of the wrench felt like stitching myself back together, confirming that I was structurally sound, even if the last project had failed. Then the emails began. They were long, rambling apologies from Dorian. He wrote that Meera had already left, that he finally understood what mattered, that he'd been confused, overwhelmed, and misguided. He wrote about missing my steadiness, my structure, and my presence. I skimmed them without replying, recognizing the early signs of something I didn't want any part of. People rarely realize the value of stability until they lose their own footing, and I wasn't going to be his emergency landing pad. A few days later, I walked into my office lobby to find him waiting there. He stood at the reception desk, shifting from foot to foot, telling the receptionist he needed to explain himself. When I approached, he visibly deflated, like a balloon losing air all at once. He said he just wanted 5 minutes. I told him he had already taken more of my time than he deserved, and that I needed him to leave. The look in his eyes flickered from hurt to desperation to something darker. A possessive bitterness that made the hairs on my arms rise. I walked away without letting him follow, trusting my instinct that distance was the only safety. Around that time, I met Selene. It happened one Saturday morning at a hiking group in Golden. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and a warm, genuine smile. Her hair pulled into a messy braid, her backpack covered in patches from places she'd climbed. She was grounded in a way that drew me in immediately. Where Dorian had lived in storms of emotion and chaos, Selene felt like a quiet, dependable harbor. We started talking during the hike, easily discussing the trail conditions and the engineering tolerances of the new bridge we passed. We kept talking afterward, then messaged during the week. She didn't push or demand my story. She simply existed with a steadiness that mirrored what I had always tried to be for others. As my connection with her deepened, Dorian's messages escalated. Apologies turned into pleas. Pleas turned into accusations, and accusations turned into guilt trips. I continued to ignore them all, but ignoring didn't stop the next development. A new account began following me on social media, then another, and another. Soon, each new notification was a message calling Selene a replacement, implying I had moved on too fast, and insisting I was making a mistake. The wording was familiar, too familiar to be anyone but him. When I showed Rowan, he shook his head slowly. "He's not done, kid," he said. "Not by a long shot. He lost control, and now he needs to regain it. Even if it's just the illusion of it." His voice carried a weight I didn't want to acknowledge. I had thought distance would create safety, but distance had only made Dorian lose his already tenuous grip on what was real. I had become an escape route, not a person. I reminded myself that moving forward didn't require anyone's permission. Yet, every time I looked over my shoulder, a part of me knew he was not far behind, still chasing a version of me that no longer existed. Then came the key revelation. A mutual friend reached out quietly, not wanting to gossip, but wanting me to know the truth. Meera had left Dorian once before, 3 years ago, because he was too stable, too predictable. The exact same words Dorian had used against me. The knowledge landed with a solid thud of finality. This wasn't about me versus Meera, it was about Dorian versus commitment. He had simply repeated a pattern, and in doing so, he had confirmed that my flaw was entirely in my imagination. The wound became an instruction, guiding me to the only logical conclusion. I had to eliminate the source of the structural instability for good. I posted the photo with Selene, knowing peace always came with a shadow. When Selene and I finally made our relationship public, it wasn't with grand declarations or dramatic photos. It was just a simple picture taken right after a morning climb in Golden. We were both flushed from the cold, leaning into each other with quiet ease, the mountain stretching out behind us. I hesitated for a long time before posting it, not because I doubted what we had, but because I sensed the atmosphere shifting. I knew that stability, once achieved, often invites the chaos it replaced. And I was right. The storm arrived faster than I expected. Within 20 minutes, Selene received a message from an anonymous social media account. "Your happiness won't last." The tone was unmistakable, sharp and territorial, an echo from the life I had sealed off. I didn't need proof to know who had written it. Grief can turn sharp, but obsession has a voice of its own, and I had heard that voice before. That same afternoon, the security desk at my company called, saying someone was downstairs asking for me. When I reached the lobby, I found Dorian standing there. He was visibly defeated, his shoulders caved in, his eyes wide and frantic. He looked nothing like the charismatic man who once twirled me across the kitchen floor. He looked like a stranger wearing a familiar face. "You're ruining my life," he accused, his voice thick with self-pity, as if my very existence, my efforts to heal, were an offense he couldn't comprehend. He followed it with a plea for 5 minutes, for a conversation, a chance, anything that would pull him back into the center of my world. I stood there, surrounded by the polished marble and the constant, low hum of professional activity. When I refused, he broke. "Right there in the middle of the lobby," he cried. They were messy, uncontrolled sobs that spilled into the silence of the room. Coworkers turned away awkwardly. Receptionists stared fixedly at their computer screens. I watched him, and I felt pity, yes, but also a complete and total distance. Whatever this was, it wasn't love. It wasn't even closeness. It was something untethered and strange. I spoke calmly, firmly. I told him I was done. I needed him to leave. I waited until security escorted him out before I went back upstairs. That night, the anonymous messages escalated. This time, they targeted Rowan. "You're hiding her," the messages accused. "She owes me an explanation." The words were sharp, territorial, and deeply invasive. It became painfully clear that the line between regret and fixation had disappeared for Dorian. He wasn't reaching out for closure. He was reaching out to reclaim control over the narrative of our breakup and, by extension, over my life. Celine and I sat at my dining table later that evening, a quiet tension settling between us as we talked about filing for a restraining order. I hated the idea, not because he didn't deserve the distance, but because a part of me, a small, stubborn, foolish part, still struggled to accept that someone I once trusted completely could become a threat. But another part of me, the part that had rebuilt itself with grit and patience, knew the truth. Safety wasn't negotiable anymore. Structure had to be protected. The next day, as I was gathering the necessary paperwork at the courthouse, Celine stepped outside to take a call. A few minutes later, she returned, pale and visibly shaken. Meera had emailed her. Meera, the one I had once believed was the sole intruder who had ruined my life, confessed that Dorian had also harassed her after their breakup 3 years earlier. He showed up uninvited, monitored her relationships, and simply refused to accept boundaries. She wrote that she was sorry for being part of the chaos and thanked us for taking legal action, saying she had never been able to. The impact of that message hit me harder than expected. Meera wasn't a rival. She was another person who had been pulled into the same destructive spiral, someone who didn't belong to the simple, two-person story I had created in my mind. Learning the full, complex truth felt like the floor shifting under my feet again. But this time, it wasn't fear, it was absolute clarity. The problem was not me or Celine or Meera. The problem was Dorian's pathological inability to handle rejection and lack of control. That clarity was still settling when I returned to my apartment that night. I climbed the stairs quietly, thinking Celine might already be inside. But when I reached my door, Dorian was standing there. His face was cold, almost emotionless, as if something vital had emptied out inside him. "You have to choose," he said, his voice flat and chilling. "Me or this performance you're calling a new life." I stepped back immediately and called the police, my thumb pressing the numbers without a second of hesitation. He didn't run. He didn't yell. He just stared at me with a bitterness that chilled the hallway air. "You'll regret this." he said as the first siren became audible down the street. No one will understand you the way I do. The officers arrived quickly, their presence solid and undeniable. They escorted him out, his voice echoing faintly down the stairwell as neighbors peered through cracked doors. When silence finally settled again, I leaned against the wall, breathing slowly. For the first time in months, the air felt breathable. I felt space around me. I felt the beginning of freedom, the first successful execution of my new, self-centered blueprint. The air felt breathable for the first time in months, carrying me to the final hurdle. The hearing took place in a small courtroom tucked inside the Denver County building. Sunlight streamed across the polished floors, dust particles drifting lazily through the morning air. Selene squeezed my hand tightly before I stepped forward to speak, offering a silent strength. My voice didn't shake. My palms barely trembled. It wasn't courage, exactly. It was the sheer weight of everything I had carried finally being set down. This time, I had the data, the evidence, and the clarity. The restraining order was granted quickly. The judge reviewed the evidence, the messages, the workplace incident, the final confrontation at my door, and ruled that Dorian was to stay away from both me and Selene indefinitely. Relief washed over me, not as a dramatic wave, but as a quiet, structural release, like the last knot in a long, held rope finally loosening. This wasn't about punishing him. It was about acknowledging that the relationship had ended long before I admitted it out loud, and that I had the right to enforce that separation. After the hearing, Dorian's mother waited for me in the hallway. Her eyes were rimmed red, but her gaze was soft with sincerity. We sat on a bench beneath a tall window, and she apologized deeply, earnestly, for not being able to help her son manage his emotions, for not seeing the signs sooner. Elias joined us, his voice steady as he said they were committed to getting Dorian real treatment. I believed them. And for the first time in a long while, I felt no anger toward them, only compassion for a family trying desperately to hold together, someone who was unraveling. We had shared a genuine connection, and it was a comfort to know that part of my love had been real, even if his wasn't. Later that week, Meera messaged me. She thanked me for pushing forward with the restraining order, saying that my decision had inadvertently freed her too. She admitted to fear, regret, and exhaustion, all pieces of a story I had never known. As I read her words, I realized I no longer saw her as a symbol of everything I'd lost, but as a reminder of how easily pain cycles when no one stops it. Our connection was born from shared trauma, but it provided one final, crucial piece of closure. Life didn't snap back to normal after that. It expanded. My career accelerated as I took on the largest development project my firm had ever handled. The intense responsibility energized me. I found myself stepping into leadership with a quiet confidence I had once buried under compromise. I was no longer living in reaction to someone else's chaos. I was authoring my own story, choosing every beam and every connection point. Selene and I moved into a small home near Sloan's Lake, where mornings were quiet and the water reflected the mountains like a painting. One evening, sitting on our couch after unloading the final boxes, I walked over to my bedroom and retrieved the velvet box. I handed Selene the ring I had once bought for a future that never existed. She opened the box slowly, the warm light catching the stone, and then she looked at me with a smile that softened everything in me. The ring wasn't a relic of failure anymore. It had become a symbol of choice, Not for a person, but for a life I refused to shrink myself for again. It was a promise to myself, made visible, and shared with someone who fundamentally understood the meaning of structure and stability. A few months later, Rowan surprised me with a photography exhibit. He hung the photos I had taken during my healing journey: lonely hikes, messy garage nights, quiet sunrises, candid moments of rebuilding. When I walked in and saw the walls lined with pieces of the life I had reclaimed, something inside me finally settled into place. I hadn't just survived what happened. I had transformed because of it. Looking around that room, I didn't feel triumph or vindication. I felt alignment, like I had finally caught up to myself after years of falling behind. I end this chapter of my life with no desire for revenge, no anger left to extract. I didn't win by proving anyone wrong. I won by living fully, honestly, and without fear. And maybe that's the truth people don't talk about enough. Freedom doesn't arrive the moment you walk away. It arrives the moment you choose a future that honors who you are, not who someone else needed you to be. Sometimes the bravest thing we ever do is close a door that once felt like home and trust ourselves enough to walk into the light on the other side. In the end, I learned that healing isn't loud. It's steady, patient, and deeply personal.